Dying sucks, but the resurrection spell in D&D is kind of boring. An hour-long ritual with no description, followed by the loss of some potentially hard-earned or easy-gained diamonds, and Bob's your uncle, you're done. Where's the drama, the tension, the wonder of it all? In this video, of course. My name is Timothy, though some people do call me Tim. And today's topic is brought to us by long-term subscriber Nathaniel Thomas and the Tank Class supporters here on YouTube and over on Patreon, who for a few dollars a month get to decide week for week which topics it is that I'm exploring and get to watch them first. Thanks, guys. Nathaniel specifically wanted to know how to make the resurrection spell casting fun and interesting rather than just adding some kind of quest for the church or the like to pay them back after the fact. It's first kind of important that we think about why resurrection can be boring in the first place. And I think that part of that might be because when we're running a resurrection spell and thus a resurrection scene, no matter how much pageantry we're putting into the casting of the spell, there's no actual conflict or drama if our player is the one that we're casting it upon. Because we know that the player wants to come back in order to get to continue to play their character, then we know that there's really no question being answered in this scene. All we're doing is waiting for this hour-long casting to be done so that they can be back, and drawing a bunch of attention to how long it takes and dragging that out really just makes for a boring scene where the question has already been answered, but we're lingering on it for a long time for no apparent reason. And so in order to make resurrection more exciting, we need to have some kind of consequences that could be gained by doing it well versus doing it not well, or we need to have some consequences to the tune of whether or not it succeeds or fails. Obviously, that isn't how the spell is written, and there's a lot of people who are very much the purists that want to point out that, the spell works the way it's written and only the way it's written. But there is a loophole written into raised deads and resurrections and those kinds of things, where you can only resurrect somebody if they are willing and their soul is available to do so. And that's where we can focus in order to be able to build in some story and fun to what's going on. If you've ever watched one of the resurrection scenes that Matt Mercer's run on Critical Role, then you know that it's possible to run these things as somewhat of a skill challenge, and that's not a bad way to involve your players in the game that you've got going on there. It does sort of mean for a skill challenge that you're looking at kind of a pass-fail scenario, which can mean, of course, that somebody doesn't come back. But if you're just looking for a simple way to elevate things, then allowing that kind of scenario works out pretty well. Another way that you can change it is simply to think of the resurrection as its own quest or scene. And in either case, you can use the same sort of framework. I'm actually a big fan of a guy named John Four, who has put out a role-playing games newsletter for 20 some odd years that I've been subscribed to for just that long. And he's pretty much been on the map by and large for his 5-room dungeon framework. Naturally, when we're running a resurrection scene, we don't want to put people into specific rooms, but that's not how frameworks work when it comes to quest design. The 5-room dungeon framework essentially calls for the following 5 things to be their own individual scenes when you're designing a dungeon: the guardian or entrance, and then some role play, though in this case they're really talking more conversation than choice making, a setback or a twist followed by the climax or the conflict, and then finally the reward. Since we don't necessarily want to create a dungeon out of our resurrection, we can simply use this framework to design the experience using these same 5 elements. If we begin with the entrance and the ritualesque setting of the event coming to pass, and then follow it with some kind of interaction or conversational opportunity between the living and the dead, we utilize some kind of twist as we reveal a setback or a problem that is going to hold back the resurrection spell and could cause either complications or for something to fail, then we move on into the final climax and conflict of attempting to make the ritual work despite this setback, and then the reward. Our player character comes back to life. Using this framework gives us a solid guide as to what the experience should look like of casting this spell, and helps to prompt ideas in our mind as to how these kinds of complications and interactions could come to pass. Once we've breached the border between the living and the dead, we've got a lot of leeway to start thinking about either a spirit sort of complication and quest or a real world situation. From a spirit quest side of things, complications could include loved ones that are trying to tempt the player character not to return from the dead, while the rest of the party are busily trying to convince the players to come on, or to convince the loved ones to let go of their friend and allow them to return as they're holding them back. It could be slain enemies or previous foes that have gathered together to claw at the spirit of your player character and restrict them from returning back to the world of the living. Or perhaps you need godly permission to return, either from the patron of the target of the spell or from the patron of whomever is casting the spell. You need to convince them to allow this soul to return from its proper place to the land of the living. Meanwhile, you could have dangers occurring in the real world, as the breach between the living and the dead allows undead shadows and spirits to flow forward to either attempt to inhabit the body and thus foil the resurrection, or to attack or harm the priest who's trying to bring them back. Your party could be attempting to fight those off in order to protect the petitioner for as long as is needed to enact the spell in its final moments. There is, of course, a danger in running any kind of scene that involves some sort of combat experience of excluding the player that currently has their character lying dead. And so one thing that you can do there is to simply ghost them. Turn them into a ghost and allow them to possess enemy targets without any kind of saving throw and take over those monsters in order to involve themselves, or give them the ghost stat block and let them fight against these opponents as well. If they're in the spirit realm, you could even allow them to have their normal statistics for any kind of conflict that might be taking place as spiritual avatars of your party are shifted down into the spirit world in order to fight off whatever it is that's stopping your group from escaping. Essentially, when you're running a resurrection, you have the leeway to be able to create any kind of story and scene that you can imagine. Running it as a quest gives you the freedom to decide on the kind of story that you're going to tell and to then see how it plays out. And of course, if you're just looking to add some additional bonus story to your resurrection, you could consider adding something like a resurrection sickness that comes along after the return of the player. The rules as written already include a penalty on certain rolls and the like, which is fine and dandy for providing some kind of mechanical penalty to, say, a raise dead spell, but it doesn't necessarily lean well into creating more of a scene and story and something that you can get excited about. Something that might work better along those lines would be if there were demands that were made upon the spirit while they're in the grave that are burned into their memory and provide hooks for things that they should be doing in the real world. Or perhaps another spirit comes along for the ride when the veil is broken and they too are inhabiting your player's body. They don't have control, but they might have influence upon their personality, and they might be issuing demands on a regular basis until they can be appeased and sent on to their true afterlife. It could be a form of indefinite madness that gets brought back from beyond the grave, or they could have flashbacks of things that they learned while they were there. In either way, this is a great plot device to be able to give you means to move your story forward, and it can be a lot of fun as long as you make it something a little bit more interesting and interactive than a simple set of mechanical penalties. If you've run or been involved in a resurrection scene that has just knocked your socks off and been burned into your memory, then please tell us about it in the comments so that we can all build on one one another's experience and run better scenes in our games of Dungeons and Dragons. Thanks again to the Tank Class supporters for selecting this topic and Nathaniel for submitting it. And don't forget that you can join them too for just a couple of bucks here on YouTube or over on Patreon. Thanks for watching. Happy adventuring.